Hi everyone, welcome to the third day of BioC Asia 2021. I'm the moderator today and my name is Xueyi. So hope you have already enjoyed the first 2 days of the conference. And let's welcome our first speaker of today is Tatsuya Amano. And his talk will be about overcoming language barriers in science. Tatsuya have started the Translate project of transcending language barriers to environmental science. Although his research field is different from bioconductor, we invited Tatsuya since bioconductor plans to support the worldwide community in the future. So let's welcome Tatsuya.
Great. Thanks very much, Xueyi, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me well? I hope so. Great. So my name is Tatsuya Amano, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the University of Queensland in Australia. And my scientific background is ecology and biodiversity conservation, which is a discipline that sets out to understand the dynamics of species and ecosystems on this planet, and also to tackle the ongoing biodiversity crisis. But recently, I have been focusing quite intensively on understanding the consequences of language barriers in conservation, and more broadly in science in general, through this Translate project, which I launched 2 years ago. So I have to admit that I know little about bioinformatics and bioconductor as well. However, I believe one of the key focuses of this conference is actually overcoming language barriers and expanding the community. So in this presentation, I will briefly summarize the multiple consequences of language barriers in science and some of our suggestions for overcoming language barriers in science. So first of all, when you hear the word language barrier, you might instantly think that it's a problem specific to non-native English speakers. But what I want to stress first is that language barriers are a multifaceted problem that has multiple consequences for science and scientific communities. More specifically, we are focusing on 3 aspects of language barriers: language barriers to the global synthesis of scientific knowledge, language barriers to the local application of scientific knowledge, and language barriers to the career development of non-native English speakers. So I will first explain each of the 3 aspects of language barriers in science using examples mostly from our research in biodiversity conservation, but hopefully you will find some examples that are relevant to your research area. So first, what are the language barriers to the global synthesis of scientific knowledge? In this paper published in 2016, we did a simple literature search on Google Scholar and showed that up to 36% of scientific documents on biodiversity conservation appeared to be published in languages other than English. But such non-English language scientific knowledge is rarely used in the global level synthesis of scientific knowledge, such as global level reviews and assessments, because it's not readily accessible. This is the language barriers to the global synthesis of scientific knowledge, and our project has been investigating what the consequences of ignoring such non-English language science are. So what are the consequences of ignoring non-English language science? First, by ignoring non-English language science, we could lose access to a non-negligible amount of scientific knowledge. For example, again, in this paper we published in 2016, we showed that about 1/3 of the scientific documents on conservation is actually written in languages other than English. So this means that by ignoring non-English language literature, you might lose access to 1/3 of the existing scientific knowledge. But in this paper, we didn't look at the details of the non-English language literature. So we recently conducted more comprehensive assessments of non-English language literature on biodiversity conservation. So in biodiversity conservation, there is a project called Conservation Evidence, which has been collecting peer-reviewed English language papers testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions. So in our latest study, we applied the same selection criteria of selecting scientific papers used in the conservation evidence project to find out exactly how many and what kind of papers we can find in non-English language journals. And we identified 1,234 non-English language studies that provide important evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions, compared to 4,412 English language studies already stored at the conservation evidence database. So during the searches, we also identified 466 journals published in 19 languages, some of which have been publishing papers since the 19th century. So clearly, a non-negligible amount of scientific knowledge is still being published in non-English languages too. And then people often assume that such non-English language studies are diminishing and science is becoming increasingly globalized. But we showed that it's actually not the case. So here's a figure showing the yearly changes in the number of relevant studies that test the effectiveness of conservation interventions in 12 languages. And as you can see, in 6 languages, French, German, Japanese, Portuguese, Russian, and simplified Chinese, the number of relevant papers has actually been increasing significantly over years. So contrary to the common perception, non-English language literature in conservation is actually not diminishing, but rather increasing in many languages. And another problem is that ignoring non-English language science can cause severe biases in our understanding of biodiversity and its conservation. So this map shows the locations of non-English language studies we found in our searches compared to the locations of English language studies stored in the conservation evidence database, shown with these blue grid cells. As you can see in this figure, the availability of English language studies is severely biased toward Europe and North America. But we found a number of relevant non-English language studies in other regions, such as Latin America, part of Africa, Russia, and East Asian countries. And these studies indeed provide important scientific knowledge for the conservation of very local species in these regions. So this means that by ignoring scientific literature published in non-English languages, we could lose access to such important scientific knowledge on local issues in many parts of the world. Again, next I'll talk about another type of language barriers, which is language barriers to the local application of scientific knowledge. Here, the point is that due to language barriers, scientific knowledge available only in English may not be used effectively in the local application of scientific knowledge, such as domestic policymaking in countries where English is not widely spoken. Regarding this type of language barriers, our project has been investigating how science available in different languages is being used in local decision-making and how language barriers might impede the uptake of English language science. Okay, so let's take a look at how science made available in different languages get used in local decision-making. We have been identifying national reports on the state of biodiversity in countries where English is not an official language, and we looked at the proportion of references cited in those reports by language. Then we were actually surprised at the very high proportion of non-English language references in most reports, shown in yellow and orange here. Across these 37 countries, 65% of the references cited were, on average, written in a non-English language. And this is a stark contrast to the level of use of non-English language literature in global studies and assessments. For example, in global assessment reports by the IPBES, which is a biodiversity equivalent to the IPCC, only 3.4% of the references were actually non-English language literature. So this high proportion of non-English language references in national biodiversity reports is partly because report authors do recognize the importance of non-English language scientific knowledge. For example, when we did a survey with those report authors, 75% of the authors answered that they cited non-English language papers because they are relevant to their reports. But apparently, it is also because of English language barriers. A quarter of the report authors answered that they struggled with understanding English language literature when writing the reports. So this really indicates that language barriers indeed pose a severe barrier to the uptake of scientific knowledge available only in English. But yeah, so lastly, let me also touch on the other type of language barriers, which is language barriers to the career development of non-native English speakers. Here we have two English sentences with exactly the same content, but there's a difference in the writing style. The sentence on the left is native-like English, and that on the right is non-native-like English. But as you can see, the difference is so subtle. Like if it has focused here versus just focused only. And the problem is that the recent study based on randomized controlled trials showed that science written in this non-native-like way tends to be rated lower, although the content of information is exactly the same. Then it's not hard to imagine how non-native English speakers can face this sort of disadvantages in every single revision of every single paper they write, in every single grad proposal, every single job application, and so on. So the consequence of language barriers to the career development of non-native English speakers is actually huge. Then most journals recommend asking your colleagues to check your English or use a professional editing service. But I would say asking your colleague is not easy at all, especially if they are not co-authors. For some people, it can be almost impossible to find native English speakers in the first place. And professional editing services are expensive as well, especially for those from the global south countries. This paper, not ours, nicely showed that the cost of such editing services can calculate to almost a quarter of the average PhD monthly salary in Colombia. So it's not very realistic for those authors to use those services. The quality of English writing is just one type of disadvantages that non-native English speakers face. The same paper also demonstrates that it takes much longer for non-native English speakers to write a paper in English than in their first language, in this case, Spanish. What I have mentioned are just a few examples of language barriers to the career development of non-native English speakers. And our project is now working on quantifying such disadvantages in multiple ways. But yeah, so we have been looking at the number of consequences of language barriers in science. And now the question is how we can solve these problems. And I'll say it's not easy at all, and we definitely need a concerted effort at every level, from individuals to institutions and societies. So in this article, we compiled 10 simple tips for overcoming different types of language barriers in science. Here, tips in orange represent how we can overcome language barriers to knowledge synthesis. Blue is for barriers to knowledge application, and green is for barriers to career development. I won't go into the detail of each point, but let me show you a few examples. First, disseminate research in multiple languages. Some academic journals have recently started recognizing the importance of multi-language dissemination of scientific findings, and now encourage their authors to provide abstracts in non-English languages, and also write a blog post on their papers in other relevant languages. So this is the example from the Journal of Applied Ecology, where there's a blog post on the paper in English and another post in Japanese. This is a recent example from the project I'm involved in. With this paper, we are really keen to widely disseminate the importance of teaching evidence-based conservation. So we provided abstracts in 7 different languages and also published free education materials in multiple languages. And it seems that providing non-English language abstract does help users of scientific knowledge. In our survey with authors of national biodiversity reports, almost half of the authors reported that having non-English language titles and abstracts would help them search and understand English language literature. Then if we wanted to use scientific knowledge sourced from multiple languages, one simple yet rarely adopted approach is to find collaborators who are native speakers of different languages. For example, in this study where we searched for scientific literature on conservation published in 16 different languages, we worked with 62 collaborators from around the world who are collectively native speakers of 17 languages. So today, science is highly globalized. So finding native speakers of, for example, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Chinese is surprisingly easy. So this also highlights the importance of developing culturally diverse environments in academia. We know that we need a diverse range of people if we wanted to make the best use of knowledge available from around the world. Then we still have so many things to do in order to overcome language barriers to the career development of non-native English speakers. For example, a few journals actually provide very good English editing support for non-native English speakers. So we should definitely expand such efforts to many other journals that have been doing almost nothing to date. And we are actually collecting information on such journals, and we can find a preliminary list on our website. And we can see another excellent example in this year's joint annual meeting of 3 evolutionary biology societies. At this meeting, Spanish-speaking attendees were allowed to give their oral presentation in Spanish, while the societies offered free English subtitle translations of those Spanish language presentations. And there was also a mentoring system where Spanish-speaking attendees could meet bilingual mentors and receive support for presentation preparations. So quite often, we blindly assume that everyone needs to speak in English at international conferences. But this example actually nicely illustrates that there are still many things we can do to support non-native English speakers and increase the diversity of scientific communities at conferences. It is also important to increase linguistic and cultural diversity in scientific activities, such as journal editorial boards, speakers at conferences, and faculty members of universities, mainly for 2 reasons. Firstly, having non-native English speakers in, for example, journal editorial boards would hugely help to understand the difficulties faced by non-native English speakers, and so can lead to more efforts being made on the part of the journal to address this important problem. Second, by hosting people with a diverse range of cultural backgrounds, we are accessing a diverse range of knowledge, opinions, skills, and experiences, which, as I showed in some of our recent studies, is critical in tackling global challenges like the biodiversity crisis, climate change, and pandemics. Yeah, so I have been talking about some potential solutions, but as you might have noticed, none of them were groundbreaking. And that, I think, is where the real problem is. There are such straightforward solutions, and yet are rarely implemented. So it's a perfect example of where knowing the path is different from walking the path. And indeed, when we look at how we are dealing with the current pandemic, we can see that quite naturally, efforts are being made to overcome language barriers. For example, the WHO now compiles literature on COVID-19 published in 15 languages, while the Australian government provides resources on COVID-19 in an impressive 92 languages. But such multilingualization is still far from being common practice in many other scientific disciplines. So what's the difference? Why are we seeing this for COVID, but not in many other disciplines? In my opinion, people are willing to do this for COVID because we are desperate. We are desperately trying to synthesize every single evidence available and send messages to every single person around the world. And it is actually not only for the pandemic. We actually quite naturally try to solve language barriers when we feel it is important, such as when welcoming new students to the university campus, at my daughter's daycare to avoid life-threatening accidents, when trying to discourage people from feeding noisy bars in Brisbane, and of course in Cambridge, England, to keep people off the beautiful grass. So to further advance science together with people from a diverse range of backgrounds and to maximize its contribution in tackling global challenges, I believe efforts to address language barriers need to be made across a wide range of scientific disciplines. Okay, so I guess that concludes my talk today. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you have found some of the examples I showed you today relevant and useful for addressing the issue of language barriers in your discipline. So if you are interested in what we are doing in our Translate project, please visit our website here. And here's the list of recent papers on language barriers in science, especially in conservation science. Great, so that's it. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Tatsuya, for the very interesting talk. So if you have any question, you can post into the Slack, into the Day 3-1 Tatsuya channel. Currently, there is no question. Oh, no. Kozo has asked which of the 10 tips do you think is particularly important?
I think this is, I mean, every tip is really important because so these 10 tips are for different types of language barriers. So we intend to provide specific practical advices for overcoming each type of language barriers. So I believe every tip is really important. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so I mean, I think depending on what type of language barriers you are interested in, the importance of each tip could vary, obviously. So I hope those people would find it interesting and important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Janani has asked, what are the top tips or suggestions for English speakers to help non-native speakers to overcome these barriers?
So, sorry, so you mean you are a native English speaker and you are interested in what kind of tips you have?
Yeah, I think the question is for the English speaker to help non-native speakers.
Okay. Yeah, so there are so many things you can do, but I'll say, for example, this tip 6, distinguish language skill from scientific quality, can be very important. So, for example, whenever you have a chance to review papers submitted to journals or assess any proposal, research report, etc., you should definitely make sure to distinguish language skill from scientific quality. So quite often these two skills, language skill and scientific skill, can be mixed up, but this is definitely different. And this is where non-native English speakers can face difficulties. So distinguishing these two could be quite important for native English speakers. And obviously there are so many other opportunities for native English speakers to help non-native English speakers. For example, when you can provide English editing support when they are writing papers or anything. So yeah, I hope you can help your colleagues if they are non-native English speakers. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. And Matt Ritchie has asked, it's nice that some journals allow authors to provide abstracts in different languages. So in your experience, are journals resistant to allowing this or open to the suggestion?
I think so. Based on my experience, most journals would allow to do this. So there are not many journals that explicitly encourage these activities, encourage to submit non-English language abstract and titles. But if asked, if requested, most journals would allow it. So in my experience, based on my experience, I have recently published papers in different journals, and many of them are not explicitly encouraging this activity. But I basically asked the editorial, the editor, managing editor, to do this, and then in most cases they allow to publish non-English language abstract, for example, as a part of supplementary information. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend talking with editors of the journal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's no more questions, so we can have a few minutes rest.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Great. Thanks very much.
Then we will have 3 minutes time, and our next speaker will be Janani.
Okay, so shall I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, you can stop sharing now.
Okay. Great. Thank you. I'm sorry, can I leave now? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you can. Thank you.
Great. Okay, great, thanks.
Sorry, Koki just posted a new question.
Okay.
Do you
There's
know?
time. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think we have 2 minutes, so you can try to answer this. Do you know of any tools that would automatically translate spoken English? When I checked,
Could you repeat the
automatic
question?
translation only performed well when the spoken language was English, such as Zoom or YouTube.
Sorry, do you mean automatic translation of the speech, the talk, oral presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not that familiar with those technologies, but yeah, I largely agree. So I think it works well mostly for English, but not for many other languages. And yeah, for example, the quality of machine translation also varies greatly among languages, and that also creates another problem, kind of inequality between speakers of different languages. So that is actually another huge problem. But yeah, because I'm not an expert, I don't have much information. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And
Great.
due to
Thank you.
time limit, if you have any other question or comments, you can post to the Slack, and yeah, and we will go to the next speaker.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. See you.
Thank you. See you.